Stanford University.
This presentation is delivered by the Stanford Center for Professional Development.
You saw this last week, so we started this. What is this? What is it? Yeah, I called it my sippy cup. Exactly right. So in the big picture, this is a sippy cup. Well, I can't write out that. Sippy cup. What does it have? Components. What's that?
Wide mouth opening.
Sure. Got an opening. What else does it have? What's that? Sure. You're going to see my terrible whiteboard handwriting. What else? Handle, great. It's kind of some kind of carabiner loop, some kind of ergonomics, some kind of weight-saving holes. Great. What else?
As a place to connect to the main cup, I guess.
Sure, it's got threads. What else?
High temperature compatible material?
It's got that, but that's probably not going to add too much to patentability. What else does it have right there?
Valve.
Sure. It's got a valve. This valve is circular. It's centered along some kind of axis.
Lock on the actuator?
Yep. What else? Yep. Okay. And then, of course, there's some kind of relationship between that seal and the valve. A little bit more about this actuator. Tell me more about it.
Cantilever?
Mm-hmm. And it kind of goes across this wide opening.
Automatic closing, so you don't have to actively close.
Sure. So this actuator has kind of two modes. And one of those modes is kind of the default is default closed. Anything else? I think this is a great start. Where are we going to start searching? Oh, I don't have a different color. Darn it. Where are we going to start searching?
Google.
Google patent.
Google. Great. What are we going to type in?
Patents.
Travel mouse. Sippy cup.
One of those two. Sure. What's going to happen if we do that?
Sippy cup.
Yeah, so what's going to happen after that? There's going to be somewhere around 3,000 hits, and you're going to start looking at those 3,000 hits, and you're going to get bored after about 35 of them, and then what? Is it patentable, or is it not patentable? We don't really know. Okay. Well, we could start looking at the abstracts instead of the full patents. That might be helpful. There's actual plugin. We'll talk a little bit more about the patent search at the end of the class today.
How reliable is Google Patents actually in your opinion?
I love starting there, but I don't end there. This is their book project, and so they scanned this data. And so when they scanned it and OCR'd it, they didn't do the best job because it's not the actual. They could have actually taken the actual text data, but they decided to be a prototype for their book project. So as far as I understand, they didn't go back and actually purchase the text data. So when you actually do a search for my name on USPTO and a search for my name at Google, you'll see a difference because Google doesn't know what to do with my name. It's a made-up name. Maybe you start searching with this. Sippy cup, handle, seal, valve, spring. Maybe you even have some kind of actuator in there. Opening. Are those the right words to be looking for? What are some other words for actuator? Sure. Lever, switch, a bunch of different things. We'll talk more at the end of class about like the patent search strategy, but I'm trying to kind of capture something here. But this is really important to kind of understand how this capture kind of interacts with the patent search. We need to do this so that we can understand what to look for. And when we type in sippy cup, which I wouldn't recommend doing that. I don't think that's a great term to start off with. I think it's a terrible term to start off with. When you start off and you actually get a ton of hits, you're going to need to narrow this thing down. You're going to need to look at, all right, so now that I found this, what else should I look for? And this map right here, this invention capture, is going to help you with that. When we look at this right here, what looks like the invention? What are you drawn to? Where do you think the invention is? Let me start the other way. Is the invention in the threads? Or the combination that this thing has threads? I don't think so either. Is it in the fact that this thing has a handle? The ergonomics of it, the weight saving, the carabiner loop. We talked about this, that might be something that could possibly be another invention. That someone might get caught into this and say, oh, well, this is the invention. I've never seen a carabiner loop on the top of a handle. When you actually put this down in you hook it to your carabiner and your belt loop. This thing kind of hangs really nice. Like they did a nice job of like putting it in the right spot. Maybe that's the invention. But we need to decide pretty soon whether or not that's the invention before we start doing a search for it. My guess is that's not really where the invention is. There may be something interesting between the interplay of the handle and the actuator. That might be interesting, but I don't think it's in the holes of the handle. And I don't think it's in the carabiner hoop or the little scallops in the handle. And so now we might say, all right, well, so the invention's not up there. The invention's more in kind of the actuator, the cantilever across the wide mouth. Here's the opening. It's got the spring. It's along this axis. Those kinds of things. And that may be where our 200 words, where the invention level of this thing is. Not at sippy cup, not at the 2 meg version of the CAD file, but somewhere there. That this is starting to build up on those 200 words that might be where the invention is. I've just built an outline of kind of the claims or the patent application or this invention. I did this work ahead of time before I did the search. Sure, there's plenty of people in this room that don't like outlines, that just want to get down to writing the paper. Trust me, if you do it that way, you're either going to have a really poor search or it's going to take about 100 times longer. Do this work first. Capture the invention. Understand what it is. Do this mind map before you do that. This is for a device. And I want to do another example. Yeah.
How much of that do you do when you're an inventor and you have a lawyer to do it for you?
So, great question. I'm assuming in this class that we're going to be doing the work as an inventor ahead of time on some ideas that we want to have a general sense of whether or not this thing is patentable. You're not going to get to 100% accuracy. And even if you give it to a patent attorney, they're not going to get to 100% accuracy. But what you're trying to do is, I have this idea, I want to take a quick look. I want to get a sense of, is this something that I want to pursue, start turning into a side project, start turning into a full-time job type of thing. And so this is what I hope that everyone here in the room will actually do. As we move to first to file, writing your own provisional application is going to be incredibly important. I happen to have taught this now for 8 years. I didn't know that this was going to happen. But knowing that it is going to happen now, writing your own provisional application is going to be incredibly important. That's the kind of thing I hope that every single thing that I'm teaching you here, I hope that you guys do, and then hand off to a patent attorney at some point after that. Great. So let's continue. What I want to talk about next, though, so this was a structure. This was something that had specific components to it. I want to talk about another type of invention that might not have structure, but actually has steps. Jacob, if you would be so kind as to explain your invention to the class. I talked to Jacob ahead of class.
Last year, I guess at my undergrad, I worked on a design with a few students in a class of mine. I'm working on a parking garage ticket dispenser, and it would use RFID chips rather than paper tickets that would allow the user to just toss in the RFID into a basket when they were leaving rather than trying to insert a paper ticket into a slot. And this would be safer because people have a hard time reaching out of the window and inserting the paper into the slot. And instead, if they could just toss it into a bigger, wider opening, then it would be less likely to let their foot off the brake or fly into something. So, or have to open up the door. So.
Perfect. That's awesome. So is there anything really interesting about the RFID chip? And that's actually really important. If you think about this from that structure, that piece, that device, there's probably nothing interesting about that from a patentable standpoint. You're probably taking all that technology off of the shelf and putting it with a backing. So now this looks like a little cutout of a car, or it's got the symbol of the parking structure or something along those lines. None of that is actually patentable. But I still think that there's a potential invention here. What might that be? Might be the actual method behind this. Let's talk about those steps. What's the first step in this? If you're actually going to use this.
You know, an answer is back to you.
What's the first step in this method?
In this method, you obtain RFID for the parking.
Yeah. I'm actually going to twist that around and say provide it. Because I don't actually ever want to sue the guy that's in the car, because there's a lot of people I have to sue there. But if I sue the parking lot, that's a lot easier. So I'm going to say providing. Great. What's the next step? So when they come in the garage, you give them one of these. What's the next thing that happens?
There has to be some way of marking that the RFID has been provided. If you already have that, you need to keep track of time.
Sure. So somehow tracking time regarding this particular RFID, right? Great. What else?
Would there be a step in front of the providing where you code the RFID chip somehow beforehand, according to
Possibly. So there may be something there in terms of how we code that. I'm going to guess that that's kind of like an initial step that not all the parking structures are going to do themselves. But maybe there's something there. Sure. What comes after this? Yeah.
I'm assuming you have somehow like a payment method to the RFID.
Sure. How do we do that, Jacob?
It could just be like another booth. Like you go to a ticket booth and you pay right there. You just scan RFID at the booth and then pay it on the front.
Great.
Does this process have to cover just parking structures?
Is there parking structure up there just yet?
Not yet.
That's the beauty about methods. What comes next?
Does it have
have to be confined to a certain area? So like you can't, if you were, say, in a parking structure, you couldn't take it out of the parking structures, like some kind of preventative device. So like, you know, when they say that you're supposed to take your parking tickets with you, maybe that this has the opposite, that this has something that keeps it within the constraints of the structure.
Is that what you were envisioning in terms of, would they be able to take this to the movie, movie theater and then come back?
I was kind of thinking it would just be like a normal parking ticket.
But that's interesting, right? So there may be something here, and I'm going to dot it. And so this is just confining or preventing it from moving outside. I'm going to just use the word confining. But there's something there, and I'm going to dot this one because this could be kind of optional. Yeah?
Like, narrow the scope of the patent too much. Like, a competitor could come in and say, oh, well, with like this system you take it with you, ours just sleep in the car, so it's not crash.
That's the whole point of this exercise, to understand where exactly that is. We need to get enough on the board to distinguish it from everything that's been done in the past, but we don't want too much that someone could design around it. That's exactly this art. You completely nailed it right there. What's next? Yeah.
You could also have a method, I forget what the word is, but like when you go to the movie theater, you know, you get 2 hours free. Basically a method of communication between storefronts as well.
Ah, interesting. Okay, so this is, what's that called? Like validation?
Yeah.
I think we're now kind of riffing on Jacob's idea, but that's fine. That's actually what good patent attorneys do. What else? What's the next step?
Well, one thing you could look at is the collection itself.
Collecting the RFIDs. Great.
And then one more thing that's kind of interesting is recycling the RFID chips is actually moving like these chips that are in a basket or in another container from the collector back to the
Great. Do I have parking structure on this? Nope. What else could this apply to? What about tools and surgery? That's way, I mean, it's way better than my example, but I wanted to just blow your brains. So just like, I mean, it has nothing to do with parking structures, which is great. But we now actually introduce all of these other problems of now there's a library book RFID reader out there. And that is going to be problematic as prior art to this. We don't really care about libraries, we care about parking structures. And so maybe some of these things start to get narrowed down a little bit. How are we providing this? We're providing this in some kind of kiosk, in some kind of garage, and some, you know, so there's some kind of narrowing of this. Tracking the time of what? This is a time of, you know, using a spot inside of a garage. And this is a little bit more narrow. Collecting it. This is some kind of, I'll just call it basket. So maybe we're trying to get at some kind of slightly more narrow version of this to avoid the library books. This is the interplay between capturing and searching. You're trying to figure out what those 200 words are. Where this thing is that we could say, this right here is really valuable. If we could get this, this would be great. And this is distinguished between what has been done in the past. But it's not too narrow that someone could just say, well, we're not going to do that one feature and get around it.
About the search. So let's say you search for each of those terms independently and find, you know, there's tons of other inventions that have used particular of those items. So how do you deal with that? Because that's maybe prior art, but for that specific component of something that's a larger system.
Yep. That's going to be something that we talk a little bit more about next week in terms of, well, actually, no, we're going to talk about, so this is, I'm still in lecture 3. We're going to talk about that in lecture 4 of just like, is that obvious? So we're going to need to have that. We're going to need to have those references, those pieces of prior art, to figure out, is that going to be obvious? If we find a search, if we do a search and we find all of this, then that's going to be problematic. If we find a search that one reference talks about validating and collecting, and another one talks about payment, and another one talks about tracking time, and there's something else that that reuses these types of devices, then now the question is whether or not this would be obvious. But I want you to get to that point. I want you to get to the point where you can't find a single reference that has everything that's on your board, that has everything that on your mind map, that invention capture. That you're forced to go to a second or a third reference. That's where it gets a little bit more interesting. So we just captured a device, very simple one. And we also captured a very simple, very elegant method for doing parking. These are the types of things that I want you to be thinking about and doing now, ahead of time, before you do your search. I can't stress this enough. You can't just go into the search and say, I don't really know what I'm looking for. You don't walk into the Library of Congress saying, I'm just kind of looking for a book. Maybe it's a book on wildlife. Like, you can't do that. You need to know what you're looking for when you walk into something this huge. There's 8 million issued patents, somewhere on the order of 3, 4, 5 million published applications. Just an enormous amount of information. We'll talk more about patent search in a second. Does this make sense to everyone?
In this example, we looked at an object that is already designed as a prototype, it's very tangible. So in our case, it's more of an idea, right? I have an idea for what I want to invent or what I want to realize. Is the approach the same?
So this is somewhat problematic. And this is actually why I want everyone to just have a quick check-in with me. Because if you don't actually know what the invention is, you can't do this. And I just told you that this is imperative before you do the search. And so that either you could do that and say, I have an idea, and I'm just going to improvise along the way. I'm going to invent along the way. And when I find what I'm looking for, I'm going to invent another layer behind that. And when I find that, I'm going to invent another layer right there on the spot. That's fine. If you want to do that, that's totally fine. But if you're not going to improvise, you're not going to invent right there on the spot, you better know what it is so that you could go a little bit deeper. That abstraction layer must be underneath, or you must be willing to create it. Otherwise, this whole assignment's going to fail. You're not going to get the right experience. I want to have this interplay. You're going to find it, and then you go back and narrow it, and then you go look for it and find it, and then you go back and narrow it, and then you go look for it and find it. I want you to have that particular experience. Okay. So this was one of the slides that I used last week, understanding abstraction layers of invention, getting to the core of the invention, identifying the problem, the solution, roughly 5 steps. We had here 7. And in the board right before this, when we had this device, I think there was probably 5 or 6 different ones up there as well. It's typically the case somewhere around 5, possibly a little bit more. One tip is that the invention's always a little bit more narrow than you initially think. We're not in the time period of man where we could just say, I invented the sippy cup, period. We're not there. And so we're going to need more things on that mind map, that invention capture, than you would initially think of. We went back and we eliminated some things, not in this, because I dotted them, that weren't essential. In the other mind map we did. I took out the handle and we took out, what was the other thing that we took out? What's that? The threads. Those things aren't really part of the invention, but we didn't take them out and we didn't filter them immediately. We came back and we took those out. Stand back and admire the invention that you just captured. We just captured it right there in a bunch of bubble mess. Is that a pretty good capture of what you did? Yes. Awesome. Patentability is rarely found when you just you change some of the design aesthetics. Well, this thing looks different. That may be great for a design patent, but that's not going to be great for a utility patent. We eliminated something. That's awfully, awfully difficult to show that that thing is patentable because you eliminated something. We automated something that was previously a manual activity. We changed the shape or the size, making it portable, integral, separable, adjustable, or continuous. These are things that are typically, if it's just this alone, not typically patentable. Another thing that's not patentable is the fact that, oh, well, this thing works better. Or this thing performs 50% more efficiently. Or this thing is actually going to be something that people want to buy. None of those things are actually make something patentable. It's the structure behind those things that make it patentable. Or it's the steps behind those things that make it patentable. And that's effectively what I was getting at right here. Advantages or performance. These things are too vague, and the patent office isn't going to allow that to go through as a patent application. So moving on now to today's lecture. I'm going to talk about novelty relatively briefly, unobviousness, and then at the end, let's see if we could actually conduct a patentability search right here on the spot. Rose. Rose in the audience. Jeffrey where?
SCP.
Jeffrey?
Weird.
SCP.
I don't use SCP. Got it.
John Wallman? Catherine Tong? What's a novelty requirement?
It's a requirement that says there's no exists prior art to the invention that you want to patent.
What do you mean by prior art?
There's something that's already patented or something that's been referenced in like a publication or something that describes the invention that you're trying to patent.
From a, let's use this right here, what we drew on the board, the invention that we captured. What would make that not novel?
So I would say that providing RFIDs is not novel because if you get a book from a library, you're providing RFIDs.
Sure, so if we said that this is the invention right here, providing RFIDs, so that's our sippy cup, right? That's our two words. Providing RFIDs is not, if that's all we went for, that's not going to pass the novelty test. Great. What if we expanded this out a little bit? Now we have a bunch of those steps.
Well, that's why you do the patent search, right? So when you expand it, you see whether or not something exists that encompasses all those things that you listed there. And if it does, then your invention's not novel.
Great. It's an awesome explanation of novelty. This is the post first to file system statute. The invention was patented, described in a printed publication, in public use, on sale, or otherwise available to the public before you file the patent application. Or it was filed in a patent application before you filed. Yeah.
Before March, if you publish something on the public market and then try to put forth a provisional patent, could that still go through?
So, and we still have, so this particular aspect of it we'll cover next week in the next lecture. This is still part of the grace period. And so you still have with 12 months in a first inventor to file system that the U.S. is going to have. And so we're not getting rid of our grace period. Patent attorneys have been confused by how the heck we're going to do this, but there's a statute. We haven't quite figured out how it's going to be applied, but the system that we're moving into is a first to file with a grace period. Yes. But you have to be the first inventor to file. If you derived it from someone else, then you don't get it. Yeah.
Small public disclosing, like just to a group of, let's see, potential investors before you file.
So in that particular situations, if this is described in a printed publication, in public use, on sale, or otherwise available to the public. And if the public is typically defined as something where there is no expectation that that information is confidential. And typically VCs will specifically say we do not sign non-disclosures. And so they are specifically telling you that what you tell us we're not going to keep confidential. Yeah.
So this invention that we've discussed just now is being recorded and posted on the internet. In a private thing that's just Stanford students only can access it, but it's still
That's a public disclosure.
available. That's public disclosure?
Absolutely.
Okay.
This public base goes a couple years ago, but yes. Absolutely. I don't have anything arrangement with all of you. I don't have any particular arrangement with all the viewers to keep this confidential. And there's going to be a couple classes that you actually go here on campus that, what we're doing is going to be confidential, and it's an auditorium of 200 people. And there's a bunch of guests that come in and view that. I'd argue that that's actually a public disclosure. Unless you're actually going through and the professor is getting signed non-disclosure agreements, that's going to be problematic later on. Yeah.
So the printed publication also involves journal publications.
Absolutely. It also involves the internet.
Right. So is it recommended that along with a patent search, you should also do a journal literature search in that one?
Ideally, yes. Actually, I had a patent application the other day where an examiner had cited a video game against my client. And so the video game's not really exactly one of these. And so he had to actually use a manual for the video game. And the manual was printed. It was available online. Yep.
So should we be applying for patents for inventions before we approach VCs?
So you have a grace period here in the United States. And so you may actually go ahead and say, all right, so this was potentially a public disclosure on this date when I talked to this particular investor. Yes, so a grace period has been always part of our system, and most likely always will be. That's not to say that you shouldn't do it, file beforehand, but that's to say that you don't have to. There's other potential reasons that you potentially want to do that. Yeah.
How comprehensive is the examiner's review? And then what is the incentive for them to conduct a very thorough review?
Yeah, great questions. So there's supposedly experts in that particular technology area. So there's 4,000 or 5,000 examiners. They're all broken up into technology areas, and they're giving patent applications that matches their technology field or technological field. So they're supposedly experts, and this is what they do. And so this is why we pay for a patent application, so that someone can get paid for their time to do a search and to do that analysis. And so in theory, they are experts, and they are paid to do a thorough search. Sometimes that happens, and sometimes it doesn't.
I mean, if they're going to get paid no matter what, I'm kind of questioning,
Where's their incentive?
Where is the incentive? Yeah.
So a few examiners are very proud of the fact that they've never allowed a patent application within their career.
Coincide with salary increase.
But I suspect that there's an allowance rate that's typical for that particular, what they call art units or technology units. And so if you're going to deviate too far from that allowance rate, then there's something odd there. In the big picture, in aggregate, if you're going to see 100 cases and your allowance rate is 90% and the rest of the PTO is, Patent and Trademark Office is 40%, then there's something potentially wrong there. And on the other hand, if it's 0 and it's 40%, then there's potentially something wrong there as well.
I must have misunderstood. You said that there are patent examiners that have never allowed an application through?
Yeah, they're actually proud of that. Yeah.
That seems horrible.
I agree. Especially if your client is running up against one of those. And you can't request a different examiner. And so...
Described in one of the last classicals that even if you do get a patent that can be argued about later on, right? So the requirement for an examiner is not really to do necessarily the best job you can possibly do, right? Because it's sort of a waste of time. A lot of patents are useless anyways in the end, or never infringe
But this
upon.
gets a little bit problematic, and this kind of veers a little bit into what typically people throw as like the thing that's broken about the patent system, and they'll throw patent trolls and a bunch of other things in there. We'll talk more about patent trolls at some point and kind of the potential areas where the patent system is broken or is not broken. But typically people would say that if we are issuing patents that we otherwise shouldn't be, then that's going to cause some friction in society. That you think that there's a patent there, I don't know if it's truly valid, they're starting to threaten me with it, it's really expensive to fight it, how do I deal with that issue? And that particular issue becomes expensive to society. And so we want to get this right. European filing fees are much, much higher than the United States. And typically, from what I've seen, they do a much better job in the European Patent Office of finding relevant prior art than we do here. There are other patent offices that are cheaper, and in my experience, they do even worse job. I mean, it's just effectively like we're paying someone to do research. But then there's this balance here of how high do we want this dollar amount to be if someone is trying to get their invention and they can't afford that. And so, great, let's make patent applications $10,000 to file for it. We would get a lot better patents. We would rarely ever get it wrong. But we might be missing out in society because some people can't afford that. I think you could actually double, triple, quadruple, even raise it order of magnitude, or one order of magnitude, and still people would be able to afford it, considering the legal fees are just so dominant over government fees. But we are actually starting to see that. The Patent Office has kind of a fast track option now, that we can speed up and get an office action within a year. And it typically takes 2, 3, 4 years. And that fast track option is $2,500. But yet the filing fees are more like $500 or $600. And so now this is a crafty way for the Patent Office to get around the concept of, well, we're not just going to raise patent application fees by 5 times, because Congress are going to get, they're not going to allow that to happen. Their constituents are going to say, look, I'm an inventor, I can't afford if this thing is quadrupled or quintupled. But now the Patent Office has offered a different type of service, which happens to be 5 times more expensive. And I think that we're going to see a lot of people use that service, and that's effectively the way that they're going to skirt this particular issue, which is really a public policy issue.
For small structures and big companies, is
Yes.
that also for professionals? Is that also the case for full
For full
applications?
applications as well. Yeah, for small entities, which is 500 employees or less, then it's half the price. And there's a new structure as well that's coming down the pipeline for March. That's going to be micro. So if you're a solo inventor and you haven't done this, a dozen times before, then that's something where you could actually take 75% off the price instead of just 50%. And so I think what we're trying to do is effectively get this filing fee up so that we could do a better job. Because this really just comes down to hours of examination at the Patent Office.
To go back to public disclosure, is there any weight given to the types of public disclosure except for time? Let's say if one person's invention comes up in a subject matter related journal, other guy just threw it right on the internet before?
Great question. Yeah, I think that might. Are we going to talk about that? No. So I'll answer that question. There's a case, a fairly famous case, where there was a PhD thesis in a library that had never been checked out. And that was considered prior art. So no one had actually seen it. And that was still considered a public disclosure because it was available to the public. You don't just get it to the library. Hey, I'm going to give myself a PhD, and here's my thesis, and just I break into the system. But no one had checked out the thesis. No one had actually looked at it while it was in the library form.
Saw it.
But you might argue that was all kind of in a confidential bubble. Your PhD, faculty, advisor, that might be considered not public disclosure, which I would say that's correct. The people that are reviewing it, that might be within a confidential bubble. But it wasn't those things that turned out to be public disclosure, but the fact that it was offered at a library where people could actually find it. It was indexed. Similar thing of like posting a blog post on the internet, and no one actually goes there, but that's still considered a public disclosure.
What about within like a small company or like a research group? If you present like, your research and you want to patent that afterwards.
So if it's within the same entity that's actually filing, that's not considered a public disclosure. But this gets a little bit confusing if now you have collaboration with other universities. Is that a public disclosure? Do you have a joint development agreement between those two universities that says that anything that's is disclosed isn't actually a disclosure? This is where non-disclosure agreements help. Non-disclosure agreements don't help in terms of who owns it, but they help in terms of this exact issue. Well, we said it wasn't a disclosure. We said that they couldn't disclose it otherwise. It stops right there. That can't be considered a public disclosure. Again, if you get everyone, all of your users, everyone in your audience to sign a non-disclosure agreement, that's not a disclosure. Yeah.
Group meetings or any meetings at Stanford are open to the public in a way. Like nobody checks who is coming and who is sitting in the room when students are presenting. So I think there's a fine line there in terms of, is it a public disclosure? I mean, theoretically, if you present in a group meeting what you've been working on, that can be considered a public disclosure, even if it's just your...
In that situation, it's we go back to the law here. Is there a printed publication there? Is it in public use? Is it on sale or otherwise publicly available to the public? That gets a little bit confusing as to whether or not that, unless you had slides. If you had slides there, then maybe that's considered the public disclosure or the printed materials.
Presented and never printed.
So we have a nice case on that as well. That's in the book. The novelty requirement is there to effectively filter out stuff that's been done before. We don't want to patent something that's been done before. It's that simple. But there's probably more here too. Just because it hasn't been done before, that's not good enough to actually get a patent. Christopher Sebald? Christopher, what were the facts of the Graham case?
So it was a case based on a clamp for a shank plow, and it was seen by two previous courts. One ruling that the previous patent on the clamp or related clamp had been upheld. The second court saying that no, the patent shouldn't be upheld because all the pieces were available in prior art. The final.
Let's talk about that, like the actual device for a second. What were we talking about in the John Deere case?
So the petitioners, they tried to claim that while all the pieces had been available in prior art, they hadn't been combined in such a way to reduce the force over the entire length of the shank.
We have a lot of mechanical engineers in the room. Tell us, what is the thing? So it's a shank. What is that? What is that even doing?
It prevents. It lifts up this plow, prevents it from hitting debris or obstructions on the ground, and then makes it bounce up and avoid those obstructions.
Great. What was the difference in your mind between those two?
Between
the two, the piece of prior art and the piece that's was trying to get patented by John Deere.
What they're trying to patent, or the difference is that in the original one, the force isn't distributed. The force isn't distributed across the length of the entire clamp, basically. It's only been, concentrated in one aspect of it.
Yep.
But they haven't really added anything new. They haven't added any new pieces or any new material that hadn't been seen before.
Awesome. Thanks, Christopher. Sorry, it wasn't John Deere, it was Graham. The 811 patent to Graham for a spring clamp that permits plow shanks to be pushed over rocky soil. Graham improved the spring clamp by reversing the position of the shank. Is this invention an obvious combination of the 811 patent and other pieces of prior art? Why do you think there's two patents here by Graham? Why was there anything after the 811 patent?
I'm thinking he wanted to get that patent so he could get people from infringing on it.
But why not just use the 811 patent?
Because I think it was such that it wasn't, the people had come up with stuff afterwards weren't infringing on that patent.
So John Deere looked at the 811 patent and said, we're not worried. We'll just move the spring to the other side. Graham said, oh, and tried to actually file another patent application on that. But now Graham ran into the problem where his other piece of prior art was out there. And his own invention, his own issued patent was out there. It was now actually being used as in part of an obvious rejection argument for his second patent. I'll take a volunteer for this one. What's a non-obviousness requirement, or how is that determined? Yeah.
I think first you have to, as a student file, you have to prove that someone advertising in the art was not obvious to that person to make that invention or make that improvement. And second, you have to prove that you also have to, the person with the common skill has to have the ability to make that, to actually create that improvement or invention.
Yeah, so there's a couple aspects of that you got right on, and there's a couple others that we're going to tweak a little bit. What was your name?
Thanks.
What's your last name?
Ling. Oh, yeah. Thanks.
Who else can add to that? Yeah.
He just merely reassembled some of the components on the prior art and basically, so it just seemed like, okay, you could, anyone on ordinary skill level that would just be able to tell that, okay, you just turn certain things around.
Isn't everything just a reassembly? I mean, the laser, that was just a reassembly of a bunch of other things that were already out there, right? As long as you pick and choose the right things.
And then after I guess it was rejected, he went back and made certain changes, but then the question is, why did he include all those things about the force and all that stuff in the original application? So it seems like he made that second effort to include certain things after it was rejected, but it was the main thrust of the application. Why did he add it to the original application? Isaac.
This is the test, the Graham test. The scope and the content of the prior art are to be determined, and then the differences between the prior art and the claims at issue are to be ascertained, and the level of ordinary skill and the pertinent art resolved. Against all of this, is this thing obvious? This is kind of like a framework. It's not really a test, but this is kind of like how we start to look at this thing. Obviousness requirement, it's coming down to, is this an obvious combination? If the examiner found everything that you're trying to claim in one particular piece of prior art, that's a novelty rejection. That's really strong. It's hard to get around that. If the examiner can't find the combination that you're trying to patent, all of those things in your claim in one reference, he or she has to turn to two references, then what that examiner is trying to say is that, look, your invention is just a combination of this over here and this over here. And that's obvious. There's a bunch of ways that we could argue that that's not obvious. But this is going to, this is the kind of the why we have, or what this is actually all about, this obviousness.
My question is about obviousness and infringement. So basically, if someone is not infringing, if he's doing an obvious modification to what is described in a patent, if that's not explicitly in the
I'm
claim.
going to cut you short and say that obviousness doesn't have anything to do with infringement.
Obvious modifications to a patent should be written within the claims to prevent someone from infringing.
Yes.
By doing small modifications.
Yes.
So that means, though, that people, if that obvious combination is not included in the patent, someone can make that modification, but they can't patent it.
Right.
Okay.
And that's where we see the Graham case. I'm going to throw this out to the group. Paraphrasing Graham, the Deere stated that the patent system should encourage and reward the discovery and teaching of inventions that would otherwise not have been discovered and taught unless there was some kind of inducement from the patent system. This is really subjective. We have thousands of patent applications filed every day. We have thousands of examiners, 5,000 examiners trying to take this fire hose, plugged up to a fire hose of patent applications. This is a subjective test. How do we do this? How do we have a test that's going to filter out whether or not something is an obvious combination? And to give this a little bit more clarity, right here, in this particular invention that we captured, maybe there was something, effectively what is happening here is that we're taking the standard system of parking, providing a ticket, tracking time, allowing payment according to that ticket. Maybe it's confining, maybe there's a validation, and then we're collecting that ticket, and then we're reusing it. So what we're doing here is effectively taking the standard system of parking structures, adding RFIDs with the twist of reusing it. Now, if there's a system out there that gives people RFIDs and then reuses it in another situation or later on for another user, that's even closer. So is the system, as if we filed a claim, a patent application with a claim on these words right here, is this obvious? And would we want this to go through the patent system? Would this be patentable? So these words right here, we know the patents, or we know parking structures already do a good portion of this, except for the RFID part. And so this is actually, I think, a great question. I think this is novel, the way that we wrote it. But now the question of whether or not this is obvious is a good question. How do we get examiners to come to somewhat of a consistent answer on that? Turn to your neighbor, and we'll have a group discussion in a few minutes. All right. So what's the answer? How do we do obviousness? How do we apply this test?
So in my discussion, we found that if a particular patent has a lot of prior art associated with it, then it's more, I guess, scrutinized for the non-obvious case, and also the more vague and broad the claims are, they'll also be subjected to the non-obvious.
I'll tell you that's everything. That there's always prior art that's relevant, and that patent attorneys are trying to get as broad coverage, sometimes vague, as they can. So now we've narrowed that fire hose down to exactly the same diameter. What else? It's your group in the back.
Talking about is whether when you combine two different things, like if you're combining parts of prior art in some way, kind of like this parking system thing, whether the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Is it just the two things combined, like the two systems operating together, or does it actually create some sort of enhanced operation due to that?
Sure, so maybe some kind of synergy test, right? The more synergy you have, the more patentable it is. Okay, so how do we measure synergy?
Possible before.
Okay.
And so, by nature of that fact, you could tell if something was, had some kind of quality that was a synergy.
Okay. What else?
Does the prior art teach towards or away from this current combination? Does it suggest towards or away from this current suggestion, or does it motivate towards or away from this new combination? So if all prior art either it says don't use it, don't go in this direction, there's no reason to go in this direction, then it can't be obvious.
I agree. I love the teaching suggestion motivation test. I'm going to draw up here a high jump. This is the bar that's set at novelty. And to get a patent, you need to jump over this bar. And we say the novelty is not enough. Just because it hasn't been done before doesn't mean that we're going to allow this to actually get a patent. That we want it to be harder than just that. And so we wanted to set some kind of bar higher than that to say, all right, now you have to not just be novel, but you also have to be unobvious. The problem is that we need a test for this. We could figure out novelty. Every single thing that you're trying to claim, providing RFIDs, tracking time, payments linked with RFID, collecting the RFID and reusing it. We know whether or not those words, that teaching can be found in a single prior art. We know that. That's not subjective. We could actually give that to 100 people and 199 of them will say the same thing. So we could do this over and over again. But subjective is the obvious one is pretty hard. Teaching suggestion motivation was a great test. Because you could actually give it to someone and they would most of the time come up with the same answer. Was there teaching here? It's a little bit more objective. Was there teaching away here? It's a little bit more objective. And so this hurdle was actually pretty well defined when it was teaching suggestion motivation. What the Supreme Court did a few years ago is said, you know what, that's great, but there's sometimes where that's not enough of a hurdle. And sometimes that even though there wasn't any teaching suggestion motivation to combine these things, sometimes it's just obvious. And so what they did is, what they were trying to do at the time was say, there's a problem and we're issuing too many patents, and we need to have a higher hurdle to get through to the patents. And so they put this thing up here. And that's now KSR. It's a squiggly line. And depending on where you jump, it might be easier to get over. Or it might be a lot harder. And so when you ask me, well, what is obvious? Is this obvious right here? Is this invention obvious? Honestly, I can't really tell you. According to the Supreme Court, it's kind of like pornography. Like, you know it when you see it. But the problem is, like, you don't know it when you see it. Or maybe there's a lot of different types of pornography. I don't know. But, like, there's, like, the analogy doesn't work. Like, you don't know it when you see it. Maybe that person says, I know it when I see it. That's obvious. That's not obvious. That's great. But the problem is, we need to have the same test across 5,000 examiners doing this day in, day out. We need to be able to say to a patent attorney, this is how you apply the test. And when your clients come to see you, like, you know actually what to tell them, whether or not this thing is obvious and whether or not to spend 40 grand on filing a patent application on this. I can't say that answer with any type of accuracy anymore. And so I just kind of throw my hands up in the air and like, it could be patentable. Well, what do you mean it could be patentable? Well, it depends on what examiner we get, and it depends on what kind of day it is, and it depends on what kind of test they apply, and depends on, well, whether they think it's obvious when they see it. Well, what's that? How does that work? Well, it depends on what examiner we get. There's 5,000 out there. Some things they just don't like to see, like they never see anything that's obvious. I think that would be that they always think something's pornography. I don't know how that would work. This is a problem. We tried to raise the bar, but we don't actually have a test that has any type of objectiveness to it. We're going to see the same issue in infringement, effectively on the other side. We don't always know whether or not there's an infringement, or whether something infringes something. This is problematic. But what we were trying to do here as society is say, look, we need to make this a little bit harder to get patents.
You know, depending where you jump from, it becomes more or less difficult than the TSM method. Does it just average out so you really haven't created any higher bar?
I think the bar is a little higher, but so maybe that's great. And maybe kind of how I drew it there, the average is a little bit higher than TSM. But I don't really know, there's no way for me to tell ahead of time whether or not something is obvious. I don't know how that examiner is going to react, and I don't necessarily have all the tools and all the arguments to be able to get to a right decision, a correct decision. And maybe this is great that the bar has been raised. There's no more bar anymore. It's kind of one of those things when you go into some countries and you just kind of like hit the button and you see a red light or a green light, and you either have to go to custom or not go to custom. Like, that kind of feels a little bit of like where we're headed.
Are you still using TSM since there's nothing better, just to get a gut
feeling? They are, and so I still argue it, and some examiners still argue it, but sometimes they could just kind of go off on their own and say, well, this is just obvious. It's kind of hard to like argue, well, like, that is not. I mean, there's plenty of arguments that we have, and we line them up, and we try to choose the best one. But in the end, like, the examiner wants to just say, like, this is obvious.
And what about the other way around, when you think it's obvious, but you still try because maybe they won't think it's obvious? That happens as well?
Yeah. And so we're probably filing more now because we don't have a good answer.
More than one examiner who will look at a patent?
In some situations, in business method, they often have the second pair of eyes program in business methods, and so that there's someone else that's looking over that. All the examiners have some kind of supervisor that they might bounce ideas off of, but that supervisor doesn't have the same kind of knowledge of what's going on in that patent application. Keep in mind these patent applications could be 30, 40, 200, 300 pages long, and they're cutting edge. And so to get to really know what that invention is, takes a while. And so if now we had 2 people looking at it, then effectively the price has to double because we now have to pay a second person to look at it. And we can't double the patent cost, because that would be unfair to applicants or solo inventors.
If you get rejected and then you re-edit it and resend it in, does it go back to the same examiner? Yes. So if you get the examiner that's never put through a patent, okay.
You might hope for something better on appeal, but that process is long. It usually takes about 2 years, and that process is expensive. And this right here is incredibly frustrating, as you could imagine, to our clients.
Non-obvious case, is it easier to pass if you get like a non-technical patent examiner?
So they're always going to have some knowledge of what the field that you're in. So if it's a non-technical examiner, it's because you're filing something that's not technical. And they're actually still well-versed in that particular field that you're applying in. Yeah?
Along those lines, so the patent examiners are supposed to be somewhat experts in the field. How do they know if they have extraordinary skill or ordinary skill that it might seem obvious to someone who is an expert in a field that may not be obvious to someone who's slightly less so?
I think there's actually a way bigger problem than just that. I think the bigger problem here is oftentimes when you look at something, if it's a simple and elegant invention, it'll always seem obvious. And that's a problem. And so right now, the Patent Office is great at pushing through and allowing, with a pretty high decent of accuracy, things that are really technical and really complex. I haven't seen this before. This thing has, 3 trillion moving parts. That thing should be allowed in through the Patent Office. Great. You did your job. Good job. But when we strip something down like this, where the on-off button is actually integrated with the thing that pops out, I think that's really simple and elegant. But someone could just say, well, that was obvious. How else would you do it? And so like one of those tests, those little mind bender test where you're like, all right, take a look at this thing and try to figure out the answer. It's part of like some IQ test or something that you do online. And when you look at it, you're like, I'm completely stumped. And you stare at it for 10, 15 minutes. I have no idea how to do it. Then you look at the answer and it's like, oh yeah, that was obvious. So simple. Every single time you see that again, you now know the answer. And so if you see the answer first, wouldn't it be obvious? In those particular situations, if I said, like, all right, here's a really hard, clever question, and I gave you the answer first, and then I said, all right, here's the question, like, would you think that was hard? Would you think that that was a hard question or not? And there's actually been studies on this stuff, and it turns out that we don't think that that's hard anymore if we know the answer first. Yeah.
Out of like the applications you've done, have you found like the non-obvious part to be like the main hurdle?
That's effectively the only hurdle. It comes down to this. It's not utility. It's not novelty. It comes down to this, whether or not it's obvious. And we don't have a great test to determine whether or not something is obvious. So we do have this teaching suggestion motivation. The KSR case stated this is just one way of doing it. Is the claimed improvement more than predictable use of prior art elements according to their established functions? Patents are obvious where design incentives and other market forces would lead a person of ordinary skill to implement a predictable variation, even if different in a different field. Is it predictable? So now we're replacing obvious with predictable? Is that any better? Unpredictable results suggest not obvious. Teaching away in prior art suggests not obvious. Those are great. And so we use these things as arguments all the time in overcoming obviousness rejections. Ken Wang?
Yeah. The novelty requirement is more objective. and the obvious needs requirement is subjective.
That's one way of looking at it, and those are definitely some of the differences. But tell me, so how, when it comes down to it, tell me the difference from a practical standpoint. We have these two types of requirements. When you're filing a patent application, how are these two things different? Effectively trying to summarize what we've talked about so far today.
So, if something is novel, then we can't find anything. So there has to be something new. But for the obvious requirement, I'm not sure.
This is hard. I'm not saying that this is an easy question. It seems like an easy one, but who else wants to take a stab at this? Sure.
We could perhaps look at the scope of who's determining the obviousness. So something that's obvious to a PhD could be completely unobvious to someone who doesn't have that level of expertise.
Sure. I'm going to focus on these two requirements, though: novelty and unobviousness.
Novelty is you've never seen this exact thing before. Obviousness is there isn't a simple combination of other things that makes this thing.
That's getting really close. I think I might take one more stab. Yeah.
If you felt novelty, you're done. If you felt obviousness, you can argue.
That's actually realistically, like that's the answer. What was your name again? Thanks. This comes down to when we need to understand that obviousness and novelty is applied to some claim. It's the invention, it's those words. And that's why we've talked a lot about claims so far. I've actually talked about claims in the abstract. This right here is a quasi-claim that we put up on the board, that particular mind map. You put those together with a capital letter in the front and a period in the end, and that looks an awful lot like a claim. You can't just take a look at sippy cup. Is sippy cup obvious or novelty? It's going to fail both of those requirements. You can't take a look at the 2 meg CAD version and say novelty, obviousness. How does it do? It's going to pass both of those. We need to figure out the abstraction layer. And that abstraction layer, there's going to be one there that's going to pass the novelty test. That no one has done all of these words, all of these limitations. But yet, the things are there if you just combined it. A method of renting items to customers. Receiving an item's selection criteria that indicates items that a customer desires to rent. Providing to the customer up to a specified number of items indicated by the item selection criteria. Has this been done before? As it's written here. Item. What's an example of this?
The Blockbuster video kiosks.
Great. Go up there, I want to rent 2 movies. And it gives me 2 movies. Great. So what we're saying is that this fails a novelty requirement. Blockbuster kiosk is already doing this. A method of, so now we're going to add a couple more bubbles. We're going to go back and say, all right, well, let's add more parts of the words. Let's go down an abstraction layer a little bit deeper. We're going to add more words to this, more limitations, more bubbles. Receiving item selection criteria that indicates items that a customer desires to rent. Providing to the customer up to a specified number of items indicated by the item selection criteria. And in response to receiving any of the items, providing to the customer other items. What does this look like? Not quite yet.
Netflix, sort of.
It looks like this. It's actually a Netflix patent. So let's ignore Netflix for a second. What does this look like?
It's like a library that. I mean, how many books do you have in time?
Yep. to order something that you have a queue. I want to rent all these things, and when I return something, I now get something back, or I get the next one. We've seen this before. History Man has done this. This might be novel in some sense. Maybe we haven't seen this exact thing, but this might fail some kind of obviousness. So let's actually drill down into that. Have we seen this exact thing before? In response to receiving any of the items provided to the customer, providing to the customer other items indicated by the item selection criteria. So this kind of looks like a library. But does the library actually send this thing out? The library gets your book back, and then it sends you the next one on your list? Does it do that? No, I haven't been to a library that does that. Do we have a good example of something exactly like this? What might that be?
Suggestions, which is similar to this, but not completely exactly.
In response to receiving these, does Amazon get this back?
Once you receive an item from it, they give you a suggestion like customers who bought this bought other similar items.
Sure. And so maybe we take somewhat of the library model and somewhat of the Amazon queue or recommendation, and maybe this thing right here is actually novel. We haven't seen this before. But it'd be obvious to have some kind of queue. We understand queues. And so, hey, we're going to send you the next one. You gave this back, and we're going to send you the next one. So maybe this passes novelty, but doesn't pass the obviousness test. A method for renting items to customers receiving an item selection criteria that indicates items that the customer desires to rent, providing to the customer up to a specified number of items indicated by the item selection criteria. In response to receiving any of the items provided to the customer, providing to the customer one or more other items, wherein the total number of items provided to the customer does not exceed this specified number. This right here is Netflix. This is a Netflix patent. This is what they claimed. And this is what they got through and approved and issued. Except for some of the dotted areas where I just took out some language that really wasn't adding much to it to make it easier to fit on the screen. This is effectively the claim. This passes the novelty, and it passes the obviousness test. And I tried to kind of pull back and have abstraction layers to show you that this thing right here is at a layer that's actually going to be allowed. And this other layer right above it is a little bit higher level. It doesn't have this concept wherein the total number of items provided to the customer does not exceed some number. That this is what they were adding.
I mean, you could argue that addition is pretty obvious. I mean, I find it more obvious than a queue. So.
Queues have already been done. Who has done this before?
Also libraries. You have get on a wait list for a specific book.
And then they'll just send you the book. Provided to you. But this concept right here that you're only going to have 2 at a time, and that's we're going to always give you more so that you always have 2 or 4 or 5 or whatever it is, that particular concept is not something that the Patent Office found. Where they didn't think that that would be obvious combination of these other things of libraries and queues and Amazon and things like that. And so this thing made it through the Patent Office. And this thing right here is an example of kind of this concept of how do we go down to another layer and add more information to make this thing something that's patentable. This is a pretty important concept, and so I'm willing to spend as much time as you guys need to get this right.
So what if you have something that wasn't rented? So like the specific example I'm thinking of, and it's kind of strange, is like when you go to a clothing store and you try on clothes, like sometimes you have a queue where they only give you a certain number to bring in with you, and then when you're done you can go return them and then take your next, the next ones that you want to try, which
I think is very similar, but instead of renting, you're just trying on. So like, I think that's a pretty well practiced method.
Sure. Is that part of the renting items to customers? And is that part that you would say, all right, well, I'm going to take the 5 items total that they have at Urban Outfitters, but I'm going to bring them 10 items, 10 jeans, but they're only going to allow me to try on 5 at a time. That plus library renting plus Amazon queues equals this. We almost always could actually come up with those types of arguments. I have a patent application in front of me right now. This is all public information because it's been published. It has been published. But the examiner was trying to make a particular argument that this tactile layer patent application was obvious combination of this other device that's actually a Braille device in combination with this other device that was doing advertising in a visual way. And my argument would be, why would you combine these two things together? Why would you take a device that has a visual advertisement and combine it with a device that was made for the visually impaired? But if you actually look at the actual, the technology, then you might look at that and say, well, all the pieces are there. It would be obvious to combine these things. But it wouldn't make sense to combine these things in that way. And so maybe it wouldn't make sense to have an Urban Outfitters 5 items at a time try-on with Amazon electronic queue with library rental systems. And it might seem obvious from where we're standing. And that's actually part, and I'm bringing this up kind of for 2 reasons. One, so that you could kind of experience how difficult this particular concept is, but the other, to understand that as a society, as a public policy, this is really hard to get done right. To nail in some kind of a way that we could reproduce this over and over again.
No, there actually are online websites now where you can go and you can rent high-end clothing. And there was actually one about 10 years ago that started with renting children's formal clothing that actually ended up getting shut down. And so whether or not, I believe with the designer handbag, the designer dresses in the current iteration, you can have a queue of items to rent and return. So you actually get a combination of the try on the Urban Outfitters and then ship it to you and send it back with a queue. The children's clothing items, I don't think it had a queue, but I know that it definitely predated Netflix.
One that I'm thinking of did have a queue, and they came back afterwards, and that's post-Netflix, post this particular issued patent. I represented a client in that area. Yeah.
How would you apply the TSM to determining non-obviousness in this case? If you were the examiner, how would you be thinking through this if you didn't know?
So you would look into the teaching of library and renting, and you would look into the teaching of the electronic queue from Amazon and this the concept of established practice of only trying on. And would there be some kind of teaching that would make sense to apply it to other fields? Or could these things be applied to other fields and work in a way that was kind of seamless? And so this is happening automatically, which is a little bit different than what's going on, and kind of reproducible, which is a little bit different that's happening in, say, the Urban Outfitters concept. Because then even in Urban Outfitters concept, you don't always have 5 in the room. I mean, if you throw one out, then the person doesn't grab the next one and then automatically give it to you, so that you always have 5 pairs of jeans in there at the same time. You actually have to go out of the room and get the next items.
You used to do that in department stores. Yeah, back in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, they actually used to have an attendant who you would say, oh, I need this in a size 5, or I need this in a size 6, and then, yes, they would attend you, not just...
But if you said, I want to try this on in a size 4 and 6, they would say, I'm sorry, you already have 5 items in there. And if you would say, I don't like any of these, they wouldn't just randomly bring you 5 more, so that you always had 5 in there. You can't leave yet. Or you can't go in there with only 3. You have to have 5 items. So there is actually some differences here. I think that typically what we like to see is when we are evaluating someone else's invention, we typically bias towards that thing's obvious. And when we're evaluating our own invention, this is the greatest thing ever. Which is really funny for me because I know exactly whether or not the invention of your patentability search is your own or not your own. Because I could just jump down to the conclusion. And if you say this thing is obvious, then I know it's your friend's. And if it's this thing is patentable, there's a pretty good guess that that's your own. I'm not grading whether or not you get to the right answer, but I don't really care about the answer, but actually how you got there. Yes?
Access to anything beyond the application. I mean, in the Netflix case, what I think is when you think about the business model, it does sound non-obvious. Like you think there's something there, so it's easier to understand that, sure, there was something patentable and something that nobody did before that had value. But if you only read that, it's much harder to know that it's not obvious.
This is all you have. And so you have the patent application behind you, and you might go in there and interview the examiner, and you might bring the inventor. You might bring the founder of Netflix there and say, look at how well we're doing, blah, blah, blah. And so you may try to use that in some kind of technique to persuade the examiner, but in the end, the examiner has these words in front of them. And are these words right here patentable? Is this combination patentable? Keep in mind what we're not doing, and this is one of the common mistakes that 30% of you will make. Say, well, receiving an item, that's not novel, and providing, that's obvious. This isn't what we're doing here. We're actually taking all of these together in this combination. We're not going back and saying, is this thing right here novel? Is this thing right here novel? That's not what we're doing here. We're looking at this as a combination of all of these items. Again, despite the fact that I just warned you, a third of you will make that mistake. Yeah.
Combination of components. Let's say you have a system that has a mechanical component and an electrical component. Do you patent those separately, or do you do them together as one?
What's the invention?
Well, it's...
So it's not necessarily stuck in the mechanical side or stuck in the electrical side. I don't view those things as actually all that different. Maybe it's just my particular background, but I don't view those things as all that different. I would go in there and say, is the invention on the system side, the device side, or is it some kind of steps and method or process? And if that invention comes down to, all right, this thing over here, what we're going after is actually unique in the mechanical side. And there's another one that's unique in the electrical side. Or maybe it's that combination of mechanical and electrical that was the unique part that you're going after. Yeah.
Would you go back one slide? I have a question regarding the last slide. So I was thinking about this in terms of usefulness. Could someone feasibly try to patent the same idea, but instead say, for example, the last line, provided to the customer does not exceed, or does not, could they change the specified number to like increase one each time? I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but if we're talking technically here, you could argue that it'd be useful because the more someone consumes something, the more likely that they're going to want more of it.
Sure. That's not something, again, usefulness is actually a really easy bar. And so if you were to apply for that, my guess is that that requirement's totally fine. Like, check, you got that one. Yeah. No, we might evaluate that as novelty. Would that be new? And if this is all you knew was Netflix, would that model that you just came up with, is that new?
One could argue that it is because...
Sure. So if this is all we knew, would that be new? And I'd say yes. It passes the novelty requirement. If you applied for a claim that looked just like this, but wherein the total number of items provided to the customer increases at every single time they submit or provide these back, that would be new. The question here is, would it be obvious? Who would argue that that would be obvious? Go ahead. Why?
Natural extension of this one.
So that's not enough to make an obvious rejection. So the examiner actually has to find it somewhere. They have to find somewhere where this has been done before. Examiners actually can't just take a look at that and say, oh, that's obvious. They do have to find every single word that you're providing in that bullet point. They have to find that bullet point. And then they say, well, it would be obvious to combine these things. Is there something out there in the world that we would increase this number once every single time this thing happens?
Similar to something like loyalty points?
Maybe something along those lines, that the more you use it, the more you have, or something along those lines. Sure. And so, great. So that's close. And so maybe this is Netflix plus loyalty points. Put those things together, you get this, then it's obvious.
Something that's not exactly like that, but is similar, is if you use Netflix a lot, they'll start, asking if you want to upgrade to their plan, which gives you, lets you check out more things at once back in the disk system. And so you can say that that's leaning towards, this idea. If the idea we're talking about specifically mentions that people who consume more want more, kind of this thing, Netflix is already doing that, but they have an additional price tier for that.
Great. So we're going to use something that's slightly different. We're going to use their website or some kind of practice that they're already doing that. That plus their own reference equals this. Who would argue opposite of that? But that's actually not obvious. Go ahead and defend your own invention that you came up on the spot.
Well, I'm not sure. I was just thinking. I'm not sure, but to me.
This gets a little bit difficult, say, with physical goods, but this doesn't get difficult with digital goods. Digital goods would scale really easy, and you could go ahead and scale this to, you got 1,000 items at a time. You have to give it back by checking it out, and you don't have the digital rights to that or something like that anymore. But you could do this in the digital world where it would be very difficult to scale this in the physical world. I'd actually argue that this thing isn't obvious, that it does pass the non-obvious test. That we as examiners in this little scenario, we have to come up with something that is like that and say it's an obvious combination. And if we can't do that, we can't just say, that's just an extension of something. Everything's an extension of something.
It's a little bit like this Amazon example, right? Where it's not so much about the actual increment, but more of the intention behind it, and then the intelligence that goes into making this change, right? So
yes and no. So the patent office doesn't really care why you're trying to patent this. It doesn't really care what you're trying to solve. You have these words.
So it needs to be in the words.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. That intent somehow needs to be buried in there.
Okay. So it's not enough to make that claim and then it gets rejected and then you write a letter arguing what your intention was. That's not enough.
Correct.
You need to put that in.
Yep. We need to somehow capture that in the invention, which is why the invention capture part is so important.
Okay, when we're talking about obvious, thinking towards the TSM. So look at this original patent. It's a rental agreement where you're trying to get a person to rent and return an item. So it would, it seems that the original patent would say, okay, you wouldn't want to keep upping the number of rental items until it's several thousand. That would not work. But what if you use this exact wording on, say, a creative scheme for warehousing goods? They can convince your customers to hold all your goods for you. So it would make sense for them to say, ship eventually 500 units to all of your customers because then you don't ever have to have a warehouse. You just have to cycle through their garages.
That could work.
So that's not.
So what are you arguing?
What's that?
Yeah, you're arguing non-obvious. Yeah. But keep in mind, we have the words there, and that's actually all we have. That's why the claims are so important. We're applying this, and the examiner is going to look at these words. And so we're going to have these words just like this, but where it increases every single time.
Well, it's sort of like a good way to argue the non-obvious side as well, which is to say that, the earlier thing I said, it would be obvious. You could argue that in that case, the only thing that's changing is the advertising. The actual effect, the user has to go in and increase their own queue. It's not something that happens as a result of how many disks they take out. It happens only on their purchasing action. So, I mean, you could argue that that's not in any way like an automatic addition of, a number to the queue.
Something Netflix added as a different claim.
This wasn't the business model.
Yeah, but
Maybe
it
it
could
was. I'm only looking at one claim of one patent. Maybe there's another patent that's on that. The inventor of Netflix is probably not going to be thinking that, and the patent attorney might not be thinking that either. Patent attorney's job is to kind of poke and prod and to try to get things broader, but in the end, I think that the reason that this was actually patented or helped get through the patent office is because the patent office couldn't quite find this. Sure.
So when you go back to that idea of like increasing the number as specified items, I was more curious about the wording of that claim back there. When it says you grant up to a specified number, it doesn't say in that claim that that specified number can't change in between. So I have a question. So my question is like, does that therefore would that cover that? Would it doesn't say the same exact specified number?
Awesome. Awesome catch. So there may be a dependent claim off of here that says wherein that specified number actually increases over time. And a dependent claim off of that wherein it actually increases every single time the customer returns the number of specified. Yeah, I don't know if you'd want it every single time you return one item. Maybe it's every single time you return 4, then now all of a sudden you get 5. And when you return those 5, you get 6 or something along those lines. And so maybe that's maybe there are dependent claims, because I think you're right. I think this might actually cover it.
Because wouldn't a dependent claim just make it more specific? So if this passed through, that means that it would cover that case, right? All right, I'm just curious.
But is this broad enough to cover it? I think that's a fantastic question. I think this might be. Because you're right, that specified number isn't, it's not narrow to say that it's static. We know how Netflix works, but that claim doesn't necessarily say that that specified number doesn't change over time. Yeah.
Do you mean that that's articulated somewhere in the application?
So this might be the next claim. So there might be claim 2 that says the system of claim 1 or the method of claim 1 where the specified number changes over time. And so we're arguing here for a moment that specified number isn't fixed. It's just specified. Yeah. And so now we're saying how that might change. Maybe there's a dependent claim where it says it's fixed unless the user changes it. And a different one that says it moves, it increases over time.
Asking, are those different applications, or are those like a subset?
I think it's going to be a subset of this one. Because I think it tucks nicely underneath it, just as Jacob mentioned. These are some of the arguments that we use to say something is not obvious. The references can't be combined. They would destroy some kind of intended functionality. This is, there's no motivation to combine these things. Non-analogous art is just a fancy way of saying, look, you wouldn't look to this other piece of, this other art to modify this thing right here, which was my example earlier of the Braille device combined with visual advertisement device. That these two things aren't in the same art field. The prior art doesn't teach the problem or its source. But what we came up with was actually a really elegant solution, and that would be obvious, but no one understood the problem. And this might be Amazon one-click right here. And the prior art doesn't teach us. In fact, it actually teaches away from combining these things. When you find the teaches away argument, that's awesome. Like, look, this thing, that same reference that you're trying to use, examiner, actually says it doesn't work in this way. Or it's inventing because you're actually trying to go opposite of the direction that you're trying to ask us to do right now when you combine these two things. I'll talk for a moment about conducting a patentability search, which is the assignment that you guys need to do for next week. It's in the book, but there's a trick here that you need to understand about searches. that right now I'm looking at everyone here that's effectively grown up with Google. And that you guys look for something with Google, and you find something with Google. And what you're doing with Google is you're doing a text-based search. I want to find sippy cup. I didn't find it. It must be patentable. That might be the right conclusion, but my guess is it's not. You used the wrong words. You didn't use the words that a patent attorney would use. They probably wouldn't use sippy cup. And so despite the fact that you looked for it, and you didn't find anything, you're actually going to get to the wrong answer because you didn't use the right keywords. This is even harder when the inventions, the things that you're looking for, the documents, are describing cutting-edge technologies that oftentimes don't have words. I use the microwave example in the book. And if you looked for a microwave oven, you're not going to find it. You won't find it. You won't find the original one on a microwave oven by typing in microwave oven. And that's problematic because what we're trying to do is a patent search. We're trying to find other references that are similar to this. And so you must go into classifications. You absolutely have to, otherwise you're not going to do a good search. And what I want you to show in the assignment that you turn in is that these are the classifications that I looked in. And ideally, what you show me is one of the final queries that you have. I search for microwave and cook or cooking and food and class 335. And it was a fairly moderate keyword search. If you just did those keywords, you're going to find thousands. If you just looked for 335, I have no idea what class 335 is. But if you just looked for class 335, you're going to get thousands. But those two searches together, you might get 300 or 400 hits. And you're going to have to look at 300 or 400 items. And they're going to have to be 300 or 400 items after you've already played around with this. And to look at 300 or 400 items is going to take hours. And that's after you've figured out the good search. And it's going to take hours to figure out the good search. And it's going to take hours to figure out what you're searching for. Please budget about 10, 12 hours for this assignment, at least. I've heard it takes up to about 20, 25 hours. You're not going to get this done in an afternoon unless you've done this before. I view it as something that's very iterative, and when I search, it's great when you have a bunch of tabs open. And I'll run a search or run a query, and if I find something interesting, I'll open a new tab with that. And when I have 10 or 15 open tabs, I'll go in there and try to figure out what are the ones that are somewhat relevant. And I'll close some tabs on the ones that aren't relevant. And I keep the tabs open, the ones that are. And then I turn around and say, all right, well, what do these four now have in common? They're using these words. I wouldn't have thought to use that word. Interesting. They have these classifications. Wow, what is that classification? Oh, that's a lot more relevant to the other one that I was looking at. I'm going to change my search query. And I'm going to do that. And I'm going to go through really quickly those search results until I feel comfortable that I got a good search, that I'm looking at 300 to 500 hits in that query, and those are all particularly relevant. If you're looking at something of 10% relevancy or less than that in the hits, then you haven't done a good search query. And you're not going to know if it's a good search or not until you've seen a decent amount. This is the problem. If I gave you the assignment of turn in 12 relevant patents, you don't really know what that means. You don't know what relevant means. There is a definition of what are the 12 most relevant. But if you just randomly pick 8 or 12 of them, you're going to get something that's somewhat relevant. And you're not going to know how to zero in on that. In the end, after you do a good search, I want to know about it. I want to know those patents. There's a bunch of examples that are posted on coursework. And I want you to look at those examples. They're not perfect, but they should guide you a little bit on how to do this. In addition to those examples, though, I don't think any of them had talked about this is the search query that I ended up using, and these are some of the classifications that I had. I want to see those 12 that you list. I want to list them out. These are the 12 most relevant patents that I found. And I want you to do the analysis. kind of a little bit like the Netflix one that we just went through. At this high level, it's not even patentable. It's not novel. It's not obvious. At this level right here, it turns that I couldn't find this anymore. It does pass the novelty. And when we add this other element right here, I think it's now going to be patentable. The answer isn't it's patentable, it's not patentable. As I've already told you guys several times that effectively everything could be patentable and everything could be not patentable, and it just depends on what abstraction layer you're at. So tell me what abstraction layer you're at. Are there any questions on this? If you haven't gotten approval of your topic yet, meet me after class. Or email me very, very soon. Again, this assignment will take a little while.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.